Recoil by Jim Thompson, read by Michael Kevin and Jeanne Paulsen. Doc Luther quietly tested the door of Lila's bedroom and saw that it was locked, and then he went into his own room, leaving the door open to hear any movement of hers, and opened his briefcase. He took the insurance policies from the briefcase, scanned them, and slipped them into his inside coat pocket. They would go into the safety deposit box tomorrow. He dipped into his briefcase again and drew out other papers. He studied them, frowning, with much of the disturbing feeling that he'd had for the insurance policies. With a grunt of irritation, he shuffled them into a kind of chronological order and began to read. Sandstone State Reformatory, Luther Psychological Clinic, Lee Street, Capital City. Gentlemen, this is a rather unusual application for employment. I hope you will give it your earnest consideration. I'm 33 years old, high school graduate, and through reading and study possess the equivalent of at least 2 years of college. I weigh 170 pounds and am 5 feet 11 inches tall. Despite serious handicaps, I've kept myself in good physical condition. I'm not familiar with your business and do not know what type of job you might have at your disposal, but I will welcome the chance for any kind of work within the state and at whatever wage you care to pay. For the past 15 years, I've been an inmate of this institution, serving a sentence of 10 years to life for bank robbery. The crime was not one to be taken lightly, and I have not. But in all humility, I cannot see that any good purpose is served in detaining me here longer. I became eligible for parole approximately 5 years ago. Unfortunately, my parents had died. My only other relative, a married sister, was not and is not in a position to act in my behalf. I was, of course, too young to have formed business associations at the time of my commitment. As you doubtless know, a prospective parolee must have a job before he can be released. He must establish his ability to support himself. I'm asking that you help me to do this. May I please hear from you? On second thought, will you simply take action on my case with the parole board in the normal way of an interested party for an inmate? You can find out anything you wish to know about me from the board, and this will obviate any misunderstanding that might arise here from my writing you. Very truly yours, Patrick M. Cosgrove, Librarian, Sandstone State Reformatory. Sandstone. Luther thought he'd become accustomed to rottenness, yet Sandstone never failed to outrage him. It wasn't a prison. It was a madhouse in which the keeper and not the inmates was mad. There was only one way to survive there, to become tougher and more torturous-minded than the keeper. If you did that, if you amused the man with the brilliant eyes and the unpredictable laughter, you not only survived, but did so in comparative comfort. But there could be no letting down. You might tire of the game, but the man never did. And when you tired or became careless... The red-haired, blue-eyed Cosgrove had talked at length, polite, mildly humorous, insistently grammatical. Luther had been a little troubled by Cosgrove's intelligence, but still he fitted specifications in every other detail, and he would be given nothing for that intelligence to work on. Office of the Governor, to Yancey Fish, Warden, Sandstone State Reformatory. Greetings. Whereas it appears you now have in your keeping one Patrick M. Cosgrove, and whereas the said Patrick M. Cosgrove has served 15 years of an indeterminate sentence and has met certain other conditions by which he becomes eligible for parole, and whereas one Roland T. Luther, Ph.D., a citizen in good standing, has guaranteed employment for the said Patrick M. Cosgrove during the 2 years succeeding the date of this instrument, therefore let it be known that Patrick M. Cosgrove is hereby paroled in the custody of Roland T. Luther for a period of 2 years, or until and or unless it should become necessary to remand the said Cosgrove to his present place of incarceration. Let it further be known that upon satisfactory completion of the aforementioned term of parole, the said Patrick M. Cosgrove is to be restored to full citizenship and all rights and privileges accruing thereto. Louis Clemens Clay, Governor. Well, there it was, the beginning and the end of everything. And now that he had examined it item by item, he could not dispel the thought that it was both foolish and dangerous. If Hardesty had not been positive that it would work, but Hardesty had been positive. He was certain that under the circumstances they were creating, the insurance companies would have to pay, and pay promptly. That was Hardesty's best legal advice, and Hardesty had never been wrong about a legal matter. Well, Luther sighed and began to undress. It was done now. He wished that Cosgrove wasn't such a likable person, but that was necessary. There had to be some reason for getting him out of Sandstone. He heard Lila's door open, and he paused in the act of removing a shoe. She stopped in the hall, her fur coat over her arm.
Couldn't sleep, huh?
Well, I trust you've got something arranged. It's a little late at night for a pickup.
After all, Doc, I am human.
An interesting, if debatable, statement.
You don't mind my going out?
I don't care what you do.
I need some money, Doc.
I'll get it for you in the morning.
I could take a check.
You can do exactly what you're told. Do you understand?
I understand. Perfectly.
It is 5 o'clock in the morning of my second day here, and I've been lying awake since 1. Excited and happy, I suppose. I suppose that beneath this bleached mask which does duty as a face, I'm still shouting with delight. I wish I'd taken nothing to drink on the way here yesterday. I am positive, almost, that I said and did nothing out of the way. I had nodded agreeably when he explained he never drank while driving, and I expressed my gratitude for his understanding of my need to forget. I drank without urging, and when about a third of the pint was gone, the questions began. Did I understand why he'd put me through that rigmarole with Warden Fish? I was not prepared to question his actions, I said, but I believe I understood. He demanded absolute loyalty from his associates. He would have no use for a man who would abandon loyalty for expediency. Did I have any close relatives or friends? No. I had a married sister who wrote me a brief note each Christmas. What had I read? Everything in the prison library, all of Shakespeare, Dickens, Swift, Twain, Rabelais, Marx, Scott, Jules Verne, Wilde, Cervantes, Machiavelli, the Rover Boy series, Lewis Carroll, the Bible. As I talked, I adjusted the wind wing on the window next to me until I picked up Dr. Luther's reflection in its nickel frame. He seemed well pleased with my replies, although due to 3 slightly protruding upper teeth, the mere relaxation of his features sometimes gives him the appearance of smiling. He's about 50, I should judge. His hair's thin and sandy. He's considerably overweight for his height, which is something less than mine. His eyes bulge behind thick-lensed glasses. Add to that a soft voice which switches abruptly from the grammatical and precise to the slangy and vulgar, and you have a man whose age, like himself, is no matter for hasty estimation. I went on talking and watching him as the miles sped by, knowing that my words were becoming blurred. Knowing, then not knowing. When I awakened hours later, the car was turning into a roadhouse near the edge of a large lake. The establishment had apparently been pretty swank at one time, but it was gone to seed now. Looking through the window, I could see why. What I thought was a lake was actually a river, sluggishly moving an expanse of greasy sludge, the waste from the city's oil field. Despite the tightly closed windows and the air conditioning system, there was a faint, unpleasant smell of sulfur. A little present from the oil companies. They've taken $1 billion out of this field, but they can't afford to dispose of their sludge. I didn't say anything. He laughed again, the same way, staring down at his almost untouched food. I should talk. Pat, I'm going to lay my cards on the table. Yes, sir? Call me Doc. Everyone does. All right, Doc. I'm a qualified psychologist, but I haven't practiced in years. I can't give you a job at the clinic because I haven't any. It's just a front for my lobbying. Grafting, in plain English. You got me out of Sandstone, Doc. That's all I need to know about you. Well, I'm not apologizing, of course. When it's a choice of eat or be eaten, what's a sensible man to do? Eat. He chuckled and made a fainting motion at my chin with his fist. You'll do, Pat. Now, what I had in mind for you was a job with the state, something that won't require any training. How would that suit you? Anything you do will suit me fine, but how can I be of any use to you if I don't work for you? Why should you have to be of any use to me? Isn't it conceivable that I might want to help you unselfishly, give you a break when no one else would? I didn't mean to offend you. I merely hope to do something in return for what you've done for me. Well, skip it. Maybe we ought to be getting out of here. Later than I thought it was. He drove slowly, glancing out at the curving river of mud, which, except for its smell, was gradually being lost in the darkness. We passed through the business district and reached the state capitol. Its grounds occupy a square mile on the outskirts of the city, the last level land in that neighborhood. Doc took a street leading up a canyon, and after about a mile turned in at a house which sat in a cutback against a hillside. It was a rather old-fashioned 2-story house with a long veranda across the front. Except for the ivy-clad trellises, which practically concealed the windows, it seemed out of place in that setting. Doc drove the car down the driveway and parked it in the one empty stall in the 4-stall garage. A coupe, a sports roadster, and another sedan, all late models, occupied the others. We walked back down the driveway and around to the front door. It was standing open and the lights were on. There was a hall with rooms on each side leading straight back to the rear. Glancing up the stairs, I saw that the second floor was arranged the same way. Doc motioned me to follow him up the stairs. Upstairs, we stopped in front of the first door on his right. Doc lifted his hand. Music seeped out to us faintly, and I could hear a man talking in a quiet, hoarse voice, and a woman's light laugh. Doc tapped softly. The talking and the laughter ceased. Then there was a rustling and the click of a door closing. "Who's there?" "Doc." "Oh." A key turned in the lock and the door was thrown open. The man was about 50, short, rather fat. Despite his tousled hair, his drink-flushed face, and the pajamas he was wearing, he looked pompous. He ignored Doc and scowled at me. "Who the hell are you?" "This is the young man from Sandstone. Pat, I want you to meet Senator Berkman. The senator was very helpful in getting your release." "Well, Pat Cosgrove, isn't it? Glad I could be of service to you. Sorry I couldn't have met you under more auspicious circumstances." "I hope I didn't disturb you. I was afraid you might leave before I had a chance to see you. Pat needs a job." "I thought you were going to give him a job. I've done enough." "I'm sorry you feel that way. I wonder if there isn't something I could say to change your mind." He stared at Berkman thoughtfully, and Berkman reddened. "I'd like to, Doc. It's just that I need every job I've got for my own district. I've got a tight race coming up, man." "Oh, hell, I'll do it. Send him around to the Highway Commission tomorrow." "Shall I mention your name to Fleming?" "No, I'll talk to him myself." He closed the door quickly, as if he was afraid of being asked for something else. Doc and I went back down the stairs. He picked up his hat from the bench, inserted a key in the door next to the entrance, and waved me inside. "Oh, Lila!" Then, leaving me standing, he strode into the adjoining room and through the rest of the apartment. I looked around. There were well-filled bookcases, a piano, and a combination radio-phonograph television set. There was a long window seat at the front, a longer divan at the opposite side of the room, a chaise lounge, and 3 overstuffed chairs. In the approximate center of the room was a mirrored coffee table with a built-in flower pot. Doc returned, slamming the connecting door. "Mrs. Luther isn't around. Not, I suppose, that I really expected her to be. Well..." A knock on the door interrupted him. He flung it open. "And where have you been?" "With the North Suite party, sir." The white-jacketed Negro, a slender, clean-featured youth, smiled placatingly. "One of the gentlemen was a little ill." "Mrs. Luther leave any message for me?" "No, sir." "Huh. I suppose you have that south rear room ready?" "I believe it's ready, sir." "Come along. You too, Pat." We went down the hall, Doc striding ahead. At the last door to the right, the Negro stepped swiftly to the front, took a brass key from his pocket, and turned the lock. He snapped on the light, and Doc brushed past him. It was a room such as you might find in any first-class hotel. The few touches of individuality consisted of a small bar with bottles, a cigarette humidor on a revolving stand with 3 kinds of cigarettes, and a magazine rack. Doc switched on the bathroom light. "Everything all ready, huh? Pajamas, toothbrush, comb, shaving articles. What about socks and underwear and shirts? All that stuff I told you to get." "I have them, sir. Everything. I just haven't had time." "Well, get on it, and get that telephone out of here." "I didn't think you'd want one, Pat. Not at all." He slumped down into a chair and let his head loll back. I felt sorry and embarrassed for him. It's always a little saddening to see a man upset over a woman who, obviously, cares nothing about his feelings. The Negro unplugged the telephone and went out. He returned in a minute or two and began stowing various articles away in the chest of drawers and in the bathroom. Doc had him fix us a drink when he had finished. "I'm pretty tired tonight, Willie. I'm sorry if I was abrupt."
"That's quite all right, Doctor."
"If Mrs. Luther should return within the next hour, please tell her I'm back here."
"Yes, sir."
The Negro left, closing the door noiselessly. Doc motioned with his glass. "Well, Pat, think you can struggle along in here?" He smiled, and I told him it wasn't necessary to put himself out so much on my account. "Forget it, Pat. I haven't anything simpler than this. At any rate, I don't feel inclined to discriminate against my one deserving guest. What did you think of the senator?" "I'm not forming any opinions. For the next 2 years, at least, I intend to borrow him from you." "I gather that you mean exactly that." "I do." He swished the whiskey around in his glass, staring down into it. "I hope very much, Pat, that everything goes all right. Frankly, you're considerably different from what I'd imagined you'd be. I didn't think that I could develop such a strong personal interest in bank robber. I didn't work at the trade long, Doc. What I'm trying to say is, I take it much harder than I thought I would if anything unpleasant should happen to you." "Unpleasant?" "About your parole. I suppose you know it wasn't strictly on the level." "You mean there's some danger that—" "Now, don't get excited. I just thought I'd warn you that we are in a little hell when we face Myrtle Briscoe tomorrow morning. You know who she is, the State Commissioner of Corrections, also the head of the parole board." "I know." "Myrtle will let you rot in hell before she'd parole you to me or any of my connections. But Myrtle necessarily is sometimes absent from the Capitol, and legally the governor then becomes acting commissioner. He's legally the head of every department during the absence of its nominal head. But he's not supposed to use that power? Not except in emergencies, which I can't conceive as arising. Myrtle's elected God knows how many times because the people like what she stands for. The governor, who's only in office to get as much as he can, gives them something else. Well, what can she do, Doc? I don't want you to get in an uproar, Pat. There's nothing she can do, nothing she will do. Oh, she could go to the newspapers and throw her weight around, but the object lesson she'd give us wouldn't be worth the trouble. You're out now. Her tactic will be to take advantage of the fact. Well, how can she do that? More ways than I care to think about. He yawned and eased himself from his chair. We'll hear some of them in the morning when we pay our courtesy call. Do we have to see her? Oh, yes. Any delay would be very dangerous. Moreover, I imagine you'll have to see her every month during your parole. I don't think she'd trust a case like you to a run-of-the-mill probation officer. Well, forewarned, forearmed. He chuckled and moved toward the door. I'm glad to see I was right about you. A worrier could be very annoying. I understand. I'll try not to bother you. Well, don't get corked up. You'll need a lot of help in getting squared away, and I'm glad to give it. I just don't want you upsetting yourself and me with senseless fretting. We said good night. I began to undress, wondering who he really was. The threatening, cold-eyed man who had bullied Berkman, or the man who had been angry over the pollution of a river and ashamed of being part of the general pattern of pollution. One thing was certain. He was a considerable improvement over Warden Fish. Whatever happened to me, nothing could be worse than being back in Sandstone. I would be better off dead than there. The little alarm clock went off at 7, and after I showered and was shaven, another white-jacketed Negro wheeled in a breakfast cart. He introduced himself as Henry, and made mention of the fact that he was Willie's brother. He was in and out of the room in 5 minutes, including the time it took to remove the silver covers from the dishes, fill my cup with coffee, and prop a morning paper against the pot. I slipped into my clothes and sat down at the table. There were tiny hot biscuits, grapefruit packed in shaved ice, oatmeal, and a golden and puffy bacon omelet that was almost light enough to float. Doc had me drive his sedan into town. I was a little reluctant to try it, but he insisted, and it was easy enough after I got used to the gear shift. The streets were jammed and dirty. 2 and sometimes 3 shacks stood on a lot once occupied by a single neat cottage, and the parks were islands of oil well derricks, surrounded by barbed wire fences. They were fine homes, certainly, but they pointed up rather than detracted from the general picture of decay and squalor. I put the car in the parking lot Doc directed me to, and we sat there several minutes while he turned through the paper. At last he folded it carelessly, tossed it into the back seat, and took out his wallet. Now here's $40, Pat, and it'll give you something to rattle until payday. Well, I know you're grateful, and you hope to show your appreciation. And if I see an opportunity for you to do so, for this or any other favor, past or impending, I'll let you know. Anything else? I was going to thank you, but I guess I'd better not. You just have. Now let's see about some clothes. We crossed the street and walked up to the corner, where he led me to the entrance of a store. A tall, gray-haired man in a black coat and striped pants strolled out to us. Ah, Doctor, I hope we're to be allowed to serve you in some way. Doc shook hands with him indifferently.
I'll let you take care of my friend. This is Mr. Cosgrove, Williams.
It will be a pleasure. Williams beamed, giving my hand a tender shake.
Mr. Cosgrove has been ill for a long time. He'll need a complete outfitting, but we have an appointment within the hour. Can you fix him up in something casual immediately and get his measurements for a couple of suits and whatever he needs? Send it out to the house later.
Certainly. We'll be very prompt. Now, if I may show you inside. Doc started to enter the store, then he glanced across the street. He stiffened.
I won't be able to go in. Meet me at the car when you're through, Pat.
Doc swung off across the street in quick, angry strides. I let Williams lead me into the store. The next 30 minutes were like a comedy, shoes being slid on and off my feet while my shoulders were draped and undraped with coats. I tried on trousers while hats were being placed on my head. A swarm of salesmen moved around me with coats, pants, ties, and shirts, hats, and shoes. And Williams said, "Quite and exactly, and I'm afraid not." Then they were all gone, except Williams, and a clerk who was fitting a linen handkerchief into my breast pocket while Williams turned me toward a 3-view mirror. "I don't see how you did it." Williams escorted me to the entrance, and I crossed the street to the parking lot. It had filled up considerably by this time, and there were cars on both sides of Doc's. I didn't know there was anyone with him until I was almost behind the sedan. Then the door slammed, and I heard the other man curse. "You're being a fool. You'll spoil everything with your damn jealousy."
Don't give me cause to be jealous, then. She's my wife. You'd better remember that.
I told you it was simply business.
Business or not.
To hell with you. Try pulling something and see how far you get. The man came bounding out of the lane between the two cars, head down, blind with rage. I bumped into him, bringing my heel down on his instep. When he doubled, I let him have a touch of elbow across the windpipe. I had to grab him then to keep him from keeling over. He was handsome, 40-ish, dark, keen-eyed, bold-looking. I could see why Mrs. Luther might like him. I felt an instinctive, almost unwilling liking for him myself. I'd given him a jolt, but after one murderous glance, he was trying to grin. Doc got out and helped hold him up, and he looked at me as though he wasn't too well pleased.
"You all right, Bill? Can I do something?"
Just give me a second. I'll come out of it."
"You shouldn't have done that, Pat. It was entirely unnecessary."
"I'm sorry. It was an accident."
"Well, it might have been very serious from what I saw."
"Oh, stop bawling him out. Pat thought you were in trouble and tried to help you. Now introduce me."
"Of course. Mr. Hardesty, Pat Cosgrove. Mr. Hardesty is an attorney, Pat. He was instrumental in obtaining your release from Sandstone."
Another one, I thought. How many? How much? Why? "And I was glad to have the chance." Hardesty wrung my hand. "They gave you a mighty raw deal, son. I'm glad to see you came through it so well." "Thank you very much." "My pleasure entirely. I like the cut of your jib, Pat. I like to see a man who sticks up for his friends. He looks like $1 million, doesn't he, Doc?"
"Pat and I have got to be going. We've got to see the Commissioner of Corrections about Pat's parole."
"Mad Myrtle, huh? Can't say that I envy you. If she gives you too much trouble..."
"I think I can handle her."
"If you can't, she can't be handled." Hardesty grinned, nodded to me, and strolled away. I crawled in at Doc's side and headed the car toward the Capitol. He was silent for several blocks, seemingly absorbed in his newspaper. Finally, he repeated an action that was to become familiar to me, folded and tossed the newspaper over his shoulder, and spoke.
"What did you hear of my conversation with Hardesty?"
"Not very much."
"I ask you what you heard."
"Well, I heard you tell him to keep away from Mrs. Luther, and he swore and said you were just jealous." Doc turned in the seat, and I felt the full power of the gaze that raged out through the thick-lensed glasses. Yet something I implausibly sensed as fear, held back the explosion.
"Perhaps I didn't make myself clear, Pat. Give me a word-for-word account of what you heard."
I repeated it word for word.
"And what do you make of that, Pat?"
"I don't make anything of it." Doc settled back in the seat. He laughed quietly.
"Hardesty's a nice fellow, but he's a little too quick to fly off the handle. You rather cooled him off."
"I'm sorry about that. I thought you might want him, so I tried to stop him for you."
"And I appreciated it. However, it wasn't necessary, as you know now. Hardesty and I are actually pretty good friends. Mrs. Luther fell heir to a small estate some time ago, and he's been handling it for her. He's the kind of man that can't talk to anyone, male or female, without getting personal. and I should have known he didn't mean anything by his attitude toward Mrs. Luther. But I'm afraid I'm not very reasonable where she's concerned. I understand. Well, don't give it another thought. I parked in one of the drives on the Capitol grounds, and we walked across a stretch of lawn and started up the marble steps of the main entrance. We pushed our way through the crowded corridors, Doc speaking and being spoken to occasionally, and took an elevator to the 4th and top floor. We turned off the central corridor and wound through a series of narrow hallways. Just when I was beginning to believe Doc was lost, we came to a door marked Department of Corrections, Myrtle Briscoe, Commissioner. Doc threw away his cigarette and removed his hat. Mine was already in my hand. He gave his tie a final pat, straightened his shoulders, and opened the door.
Miss Briscoe, Dr. Luther and Mr. Cosgrove are here too. So he showed up, did he? Well, lock the vault and send 'em in. Send 'em both in. Come right in, gentlemen.
We went in, and the girl closed the door behind us. I imagine every convict and ex-convict in the country has heard of Myrtle Briscoe. She'd held an elective office in a politician's graveyard for 30 years and remained honest. She was about 5 feet tall, including the red, discolored topknot of her hair. She wore a white shirtwaist with a high collar, high-topped button shoes, and a skirt that resembled a horse blanket. She stood up as we entered, but she didn't offer to shake hands.
Sit down there. I want you birds where I can watch you.
Really, Miss Briscoe, is
Shut
that...
your big bazoo and keep it shut until I tell you to open it. Cosgrove, where'd you get those clothes? You look like a pawn shop salesman.
Miss Briscoe, I will not
Will
tolerate...
you shut up? Cosgrove?
Dr. Luther bought them for me.
Why?
It's too cold to go without any. The state fund for buying them seems to be exhausted. She leaned back in her chair, eyes glinting.
Any idea why it is exhausted?
No, ma'am. But I've been in prison for 15 years.
All right, Cosgrove. I stepped into that one. Now I'm going to tell you the secret behind that non-existent state fund. I'm going to tell you why you don't have any money to buy books at Sandstone, why the food is slop, why this, one of the richest states in the Union, has become a beggar among the other commonwealths.
I'm sorry, Miss Briscoe. I didn't mean...
It's because we're eaten up by rats. That's the only name for them, and I don't give a damn how nicely they dress and talk or how generous hell, they are to people who play along with them. Who else but rats would foist inferior textbooks upon children? Who else would take money at the cost of leaving dangerous highways unrepaired? Who else would build fire traps for helpless old men and women? Who else would place 2,000 men in the care of a maniac to be starved and tortured, yes, and killed? Well, what do you say, Cosgrove? You of all people ought to agree with me.
I read the Brookings Institution report.
Oh, you did. Well, well. But what did you do when my investigators were there at Sandstone? Did you talk to them? Tell them exactly what you were up against?
No, ma'am.
You're damned right you didn't. You expect one woman with the lowest budget
But I know some that did talk. For a full minute, she was silent. Then she sighed, scowled, and looked at Doc.
Doctor, why wasn't the application for Cosgrove's parole made in the usual way?
Senator Bergman thought
Senator Berkman never had a thought in his life, and you can tell him I said so. You were confident I wouldn't parole anyone to you, weren't you? Don't bother to answer. Where will Cosgrove be employed? In that brothel of yours?
Miss Briscoe, I don't care for your language. I plan on getting him a job with the state. Of course, he's technically in my employ
I
until...
know the routine. And you, Cosgrove, you're willing to be another hog at the public trough?
I smiled at her.
Foolish question, huh? Doc give you any reason for all this dough he's blowing on you?
Whatever's spent on me, I intend to pay back.
Any idea what a caper of this kind costs, Red? Hardesty was in on it. So is Berkman. So are the legislatures he's horse-traded into bringing pressure on the governor.
Miss Briscoe...
Doc, if you don't shut up, I'll put you out of the office. So that's your picture, Red, or most of it. I don't mean that Doc spent much actual cash in getting you out. What he and his crowd spent were pledges. They tacitly canceled certain favors owing them and obligated themselves for others. They used up a lot of their steam they could use right now. Now, why do you think they did that, Red?
I know why, but I'd prefer that Doc explained it to you.
Smart. Can you cook, too?
Miss Briscoe, I want you to believe I helped Pat for just one reason. Because he needed help and deserved it, and I was in a position to give it.
I know you want me to believe that.
Pat served 15 years for a robbery in which nothing was lost and no one was hurt. He served it not because he was a criminal, but because he wasn't. He should never have been sent to anything but a juvenile correction institution.
You're right there.
Pat stayed in Sandstone 5 years after he was eligible for parole. He could have spent his whole life there, solely because he had no friends or money.
And you got him out, solely out of the goodness of your heart.
Put it this way. I've made a lot of mistakes. Maybe this will help wipe some of them out. Myrtle Briscoe stared at him.
Damn it, Duck, I'd like to believe that.
It's the truth.
Maybe. Maybe not.
Myrtle Briscoe came round the desk and gripped me by both arms and looked up into my face.
I was kidding about the clothes. You look good, and you're gonna have to be good. Hard as it may be, and even if we both think it's nonsense. You know what I mean. No drunks, no wild women, no rough stuff. That's what the book says, that's what I say, as long as they say it.
Yes, ma'am.
Maybe. Get the hell out of here.
There was a restaurant in the basement of the Capitol, and Doc and I ate lunch there. Several people stopped by our table. There was a Senator Flanders with a man who, as nearly as I could make out, was a textbook salesman. Another senator named Cronop. Several people. I saw them all later from time to time, around Doc's house. Berkman came in just as we were finishing the ale and took a chair at our table. There were pouches under his eyes, and his voice was even more hoarse than it had been the night before. We're going to have to baby her along a little bit, Doc. Get her some better offices. Let her have another investigator. Might not be a bad idea. You'd better tour around with me this afternoon, Doc. I want you to tell the governor... Berkman paused, looking from me to Doc. I meant to tell you, Pat, I got that job for you. Drop around to the Highway Commission tomorrow morning and ask for Mr. Fleming. Thank you very much. What does it pay? 2.5. Best I could do right now. Could be worse. What about it, Pat? Do you think you can accept a job at $250 a month? I'm very grateful. I only hope I'll be able to do the work. Berkman's eyes widened. Then he leaned back and roared with laughter. Doc chuckled. Well, the job won't be too difficult. I'm going to be tied up for the next couple of hours. Is there anything you'd like to do? Nothing in particular. I wouldn't mind strolling around the building. That's a good idea. Give the people a chance to see what the well-dressed man is wearing. Where shall I meet you? Oh, make it the front entrance. I said I'd be there, shook hands with the senator, and left. It took me almost an hour to find the State Historical Museum. Most of the cases and cabinets were empty. I went from the museum to the State Library, closed for repairs. Then, since my time was running short, I located the Highway Commission offices and went out to the entrance to wait for Doc. I was leaning against a stone balustrade and starting to light a cigarette when she came out. I disliked trying to describe her because the physical facts of a person so seldom add up to what that person really is. She was no youngster. Every line of her full but compact body spoke the mature woman, and she made no attempt to appear one. She was just herself, forever young, and I could not picture her acting or dressing in any other way than she did. She wore a plain blue dress with a white collar and a little white belt tied in the back. She wore low-heeled shoes, and I think her firm, round legs were bare. She had a black straw hat with a saucer-like brim which was slung over her arm by its elastic band. Her crisp brown hair was pulled back in a single thick curl, barely reaching to her shoulders and tied with a tiny white ribbon. She stood at the top of the steps for a minute, breathing deeply, happily, her brown eyes and her small straight nose, her entire face crinkling with good humor. She smiled at me, without actually seeing me, of course, simply because it was a nice day and she was alive, and that was good. Then she went jauntily down the steps, the hat swinging over her arm, the little belt spanking her gently on her bottom. I wanted to run after her, ask her name, hold her somehow, never let her go away. And I remembered who I was, Doc, Myrtle Briscoe, Sandstone, and I could only stand and watch, feeling sick and empty. Near the end of the walk, she stepped over into the driveway and started down the row of parked cars. She stopped at Doc's big black sedan, glanced casually over her shoulder, and opened the door.
I stood where I was for a moment, unable to believe what I had seen. Then I went down the steps 3 at a time. I cut across the driveway and ran, stooping along the far row of cars. I came parallel with Doc's sedan, vaulted silently over a bumper, and dropped down behind her. She was kneeling on the seat of the car. Her back, well, not her back exactly, to me. She pulled a zipper on the seat cover, reached in between the cover and the seat, and fumbled for a moment. She brought out a thick brown envelope. She put a foot down on the running board and started to back out. I was in the way. She wiggled a little, not realizing that someone was behind her. She pushed, and I pushed back. She looked around then.
Oh!
Her mouth dropped open. Then the smile returned, and she cocked her head on one side.
Now, really, don't you think you should ask a girl first?
I backed off a step, feeling my face go red. I'm with Dr. Luther. I saw you take something. That envelope.
No. What do people call you, you pretty red-haired man?
My name's Cosgrove. Patrick Cosgrove. And I'll take that envelope.
Bet you won't.
Now look, Miss...
Flournoy. Madeline Flournoy.
You say that like it should mean something to me, but it doesn't. I'm afraid...
I work for Doc. He sent me after these contracts. Now, is that good enough for you, or do you want to wrestle?
If you work for Doc, you won't mind my walking back with you to where he is.
I don't mind at all, Patsy. But I've made it a lifelong principle never to give in to a redhead.
I'm sorry. I'll either have to go with you or have you wait here until Doc comes. She put the papers in her hat behind her, lowered her head, and walked right into me. She pushed against me, and I could hear her teeth gritting. I tried to reach around her and grab the papers. Instead, I caught hold of her hat, breaking the band that held it to her arm. It struck the running board and rolled between us.
Now see what you did.
I'm sorry. We both reached for it at the same time. Our heads bumped painfully. It gave me a bad jolt, and I know it must have hurt her worse. I said I was sorry again and started to pick up the hat. She brought her knee against my chin with a force that almost knocked me out. It was instinctive, a natural animal reaction to pain. What I did was also instinctive. I grabbed her by the ankles and jerked upwards. She sailed through the door of the car, opened fortunately, and landed bouncing on the seat. Her feet went up in the air and her dress flew over her head. Just what the hell is going on here? His hat was jammed low on his sandy hair, and he pushed me to one side and almost jerked her off the seat. What in the name of God is the matter with you, Madeline? I sent you after those contracts 30 minutes ago, and I waited and waited until my parties gave up and left. And then I come out here and find you showing your backside to...
Was not backside, was underneath side.
To hell with that stuff. You're not a kid. You're not being paid kids' wages. If you can't snap out of it and do your work like you're supposed to, I'll get someone who will.
Bet you couldn't. Bet you couldn't get anyone that knows half as much as I do.
Damn it! He stared at her helplessly, swallowing whatever else he had been about to say. It's my fault, Doc. I saw her get those papers out of the car and I jumped to the wrong conclusion.
And I was nasty to him in my own peculiar way.
I can imagine. Well, I guess I'm as much at fault as anyone. I'd forgotten about Pat waiting there at the entrance. By the way, you two had better meet each other. He introduced us casually and opened the door of the car. Make another copy of those contracts tonight, Madeline, and bring them out here in the afternoon. Same place, same time, on time.
I was going to a show tonight.
Go ahead. Get up early in the morning and work. I don't care when you do them.
Well...
She stood near the door, pouting, and with her left hand she scrawled an address in the dust on the car's side and wrote noon beneath it.
Well, you and Mr. Cosgrove can drive me home then.
We've something important to do. Come along, Pat. I rubbed out the writing, nodded to her, and walked on around the car. As I drove away, she put her hands behind her and stuck her tongue out at Doc. That woman. If she wasn't so valuable to me. She's your secretary? Call her that. She's actually a great deal more, does things that aren't ordinarily included in secretarial work. She knows, well, you heard her. She knows. I see. There's a perfect example of what being sorry for a person can get you into. When I first ran into her, I thought she was one of the most pitiable, helpless little tykes that ever came out of business college. Raised by an aunt who kicked her out when she was 16. I can understand why now. Worked her way through school as a waitress with all the big bad men insulting her. Just wanted to work real hard for a nice fatherly man like me who would give her good advice. Well, isn't she a pretty disrupting influence to have around? She gets on my nerves plenty, yes.
But she's smart and fast, and people like her in spite of themselves. They let the guards down around her before they realize she's not half as giddy as she appears to be.
Excuse me, Doc. Where did you want to drive to?
Why, home, I suppose, unless you got someplace you'd like to go.
Not at all. I just thought I understood you to say,
That was a brush off. I have to use her in my business. I don't have to cart her around, give her any kind of a personal hold on me. Incidentally, Pat.
Yes, I said, knowing what was coming.
I want you to keep away from her, too. I know you're loyal and grateful to me, that you wouldn't do anything that might injure me. But it's simply a bad idea for two people so close to my affairs to get on an intimate basis. You understand, Pat? I won't tolerate it.
He turned to look at me. I nodded, not trusting my voice.
I'm counting on you.
I led him out at the front of the house and drove the car onto the garage. Then another car, the sports roadster I'd seen the night before, swept down the driveway. It shot into the stall next to the sedan, tires sliding. A woman got out and came swiftly toward me, smiling, hands extended. She was above average height and slender, yet there was a soft, billowy look about her. Her hair was ash blonde, and she had the smooth, flawless complexion which should, but so seldom does, accompany it. She wore a tailored fawn-colored suit with a fox fur scarf around the shoulders. She was a very beautiful woman of 30 or thereabouts, a little theatrical in her actions, but beautiful, and absolutely nothing else.
You're Pat Cosgrove. Doctor's told me so much about you. I'm Lila Luther.
How do you do, Mrs. Luther?
I was going to drop in last night and say hello, but Doctor said you were tired. And of course he snatched you away this morning before I got my eyes open.
Well...
Do come along.
She leaned her wrist over my arm.
I want you to show me your room. Doctor assured me you were made utterly comfortable, but naturally he wouldn't know if you weren't. Isn't he a weird man? But sweet, very sweet.
I like him. The room is fine.
Oh, well, of course you would like him. Do you know Mr. Hardesty? I like him very much, don't you? He's such a smooth, earnest man. So unweird.
She chattered incessantly as we went up the driveway and around the walk to the house, apparently so intrigued with the sound of her own voice that my tense silence went unnoticed. At the door of her apartment, she rapped briskly and called,
Doctor, I'll be with Mr. Cosgrove for a few minutes.
Then, without waiting for a reply, she urged me down the hall, her long, soft thigh brushing against mine. I unlocked the door of my room and pushed it open for her. She took my arm and we went in together.
Well, they haven't done too badly by you.
It's far better than anything I've had. There's really nothing I need, Mrs. Luther.
Nothing at all?
She gave my arm a sly squeeze.
Well, I do. I need a drink.
Mrs. Luther, do you...
What? Oh, some of that bourbon will be all right, with just a little water, please.
I nodded and went over to the bar, hearing the door ease shut almost the moment my back was turned. Doc would resent my ordering her out. No matter what he might think about her himself, he would resent anyone else's implication that she was less than she could be. I could only hope he would not let jealousy get the better of his common sense. Surely he must realize that I would not play loose with his wife. I mixed the drink and brought it over to her. I lighted her cigarette. I tried not to notice as she toed off her high-heeled suede slippers.
Do sit down, Pat. Oh, where's your drink?
I don't drink very much, Mrs. Luther. I don't think I want one just now.
But I never drink alone.
Mrs. Luther.
Lila. Or don't you like the name?
I like it very much, but...
Say it, then.
Lila. What happened then was so completely insane that I almost doubt it happened. She set her glass on the floor and arose, letting the fox scarf slide from her shoulders. She put her arms around me and turning me, and slumped backwards. She went down on the bed, drawing me down with her. Her eyes were closed and she was breathing deeply, and her head rocked a little from side to side. Her lips parted and she raised them up towards mine. And almost I bent down to them. I wanted to. I wanted her. It must have been the red of her mouth which brought me to my senses. Lipstick, evidence, penalty, or perhaps I heard the soft footsteps in the thickly carpeted hallway, although that does not seem possible. Whatever the case was, I did not bend down. I reversed the trick she had pulled on me. I moved up and backwards, swiftly, jerking her upright before she could release her hold. I caught her by the elbow, swung her in an arc, and dropped her into the chair. I swept the hair back from her face. I dropped the scarf around her shoulders.
I slipped the shoes on her feet and thrust the glass into her hand. I made a leap for the door. It was locked. She had turned the latch. I turned it again, turning the knob noisily at the same time. As I did so, I felt it turn from the other side, and Dr. Luther walked in. I was going to call you, Doc. Mrs. Luther thought you might have time for a drink with us. He shook his head. He looked her over very carefully. Are you through with your drink yet?
It doesn't look like it, does it?
Drink it up, then, or take it with you. She stared at him, smiling in a funny way, swinging one long, perfect leg. Lila, don't you think...
I'll tell you what I think. I think you'd better take it.
She hurled the contents of the glass squarely into his face. I wanted to slap her. I hoped no matter what happened to me that Doc would. Instead, he merely stood there helplessly, the whiskey dripping down from his glasses, running in little rivulets down his mouth and chin. Mrs. Luther laughed shortly. She turned and gave me a bright, vacant smile.
Sorry about the carpet, Pat.
She strolled out of the room, closing the door behind her.